In the last 100 years, men and women have covered more ground than was ever thought possible. In this first segment, we revisit the great moments that have shaped the first part of our century, beginning with the years 1900 to 1929. Horses were on their way out, autos cruise into our lives, women want and get the vote, great nations march to war, and the roaring stock markets of the 20s plunged the world into a depression. And so the 20th century begins with the electric light bulb and the first radio waves ever broadcast by mankind. Man's own voice, like a stone dropped into a still pond, ripples invisibly through the air, heralding 100 years of unprecedented change that would topple the pillars of 19th century convention and force the world to redefine itself. The moving camera, a new device invented by the man responsible for lighting this new era. Thomas Edison captures the look and feel at the turn of the century. Horse-drawn carriages, bowlers, and bustles define cityscapes, while trolley cars move the masses. In Europe, economic strife or political persecution lead many to risk all and take a chance on a voyage to America. The faces aboard those ships would turn into the new face of America, consisting mostly of Russians, Germans, Italians, Swedes, and Irish. The rich European heritage these groups bring with them will eventually be woven into the ever-expanding American identity. Ellis Island becomes the first stop for the newly arrived immigrants. From here, the immigrants then travel throughout the country. Many Germans and Swedes choose Chicago or the farmlands of the Midwest. For large numbers of Irish, Russians, and Italians, New York's Lower East Side becomes their home. Outdoor markets supply both jobs and product. Urban expansion begins its upward climb. Masons, carpenters, and day laborers from Europe provide the workforce needed for this endeavor. A massive project begins at the corner of 34th Street and Broadway. 1 square city block is to be excavated. Lacking the heavy machinery of today, it's done with shovel, pick, and the muscle of men. Each phase of construction brings the huge Macy Building, a landmark which survives today, closer to completion. But New York was not the only city reaching for the sky. New construction altered the skylines of Chicago, Detroit, and San Francisco. While New York builds up its skyline, the city of San Francisco is toppled by a devastating earthquake. Buildings crumble, and severed gas lines set the city ablaze. 700 people are killed, and in just a few hours, over 200,000 find themselves homeless. The city is shattered, but the people and the industries that built it are still standing firm. Thousands of displaced people move to Oakland. Many others stay on. Tent cities spring up in parks and open spaces. Food is passed out to the hungry crowds. Banks and businesses shore up the damage and adjust themselves while the cleanup efforts begin. Automobiles are still a luxury, but old-fashioned horsepower serves people well. Parched people and animals bear the heavy work of reconstruction. as precious water is brought in on ferries. Picking their way through the rubble, people continue on with the tasks of their everyday lives. Supplies are brought in by Army pack trains. It takes just a short time to restart the trolley cars. In just 3 short years, the city is rebuilt on strong steel frames. By 1915, a brand new San Francisco plays host to the World's Fair. There were other car makers before Henry Ford, but none had the impact on people's lives like Ford. He revolutionized mass production of the auto. With his affordable car, the distances between people didn't seem quite so great. A new figure emerges from the new technological age, Henry Ford. While working at the Edison Illuminating Company in Detroit, Ford, along with several of his co-workers, began to develop his first gasoline-powered automobile, the quadricycle. In 1903, he founds Ford Motor Company on just $100,000. With frames and parts borrowed from the Dodge brothers and European car makers, Ford creates a sort of hybrid automobile. The investors want an elegant toy for the rich. Ford splits from his financial backers and establishes total control over the company. Ford declares, "I'm going to democratize the automobile, and when I'm through, everybody will be able to afford one, and about everybody will have one." His next big move is to begin producing his own car parts. No more hybrid automobiles. Fords will be Fords from the ground up. His team of ex-Edison co-workers and practical-minded Ford employees work long hours for a whole year perfecting the new car. They give it a 20-horsepower engine, a lightweight steel alloy body for speed and agility, tough springs, and a high clearance for navigating America's demanding rural roadways. The Model T is born, and it's a hit. In October of 1908, the Model T goes to market, selling for the unheard-of bargain price of $805. From 1909 to 1910, the company sells 18,664 cars. The pace doesn't slow down. For each of the following years, production doubles. Sales begin outpacing production, necessitating a more efficient process of production. Adopting and actually improving upon a technique used by machine and weapons manufacturers of the day, Ford introduces the assembly line to his car factory. The Model T is a stripped-down, no-frills workhorse. Production focuses on producing the basic Model T. No special features, no body updates, no special color. By using this technique, the factory's output soars, and the cost of producing each car drops so much that Ford is able to cut the price to under $300. Ford famously joked that the customer could have the Model T in any color he wanted, as long as it was black, which happened to be the color of enamel that dried fastest. Ford astounds the nation and Wall Street by announcing that he will double his workers' basic pay to $5 a day. It's an unheard of amount, but Ford sees it as a means to stop the employee turnover on the monotonous assembly lines. He also figures that the money he spends would come back to the company when his employees buy a car they can now afford.
Taylorism was a new mode of organizing the production of goods, especially in the factory, that was really given a tremendous fillip with Henry Ford's assembly line. And although it was tremendously efficient, it was also tremendously oppressive because it took a job that beforehand had been done by one or two skilled craftspeople and subdivided it into simplified work that could be done by many people without much training. And it was perceived as being oppressive, at least by the 1920s and 1930s. Taylorism had a very bad press.
People fall in love with Ford's automobile. It seems everywhere you look, people are driving his Tin Lizzie and enjoying the new freedom it brings them. People and places that had been out of reach become accessible by car. Roadside industries like motels and diners begin to spring up around the new auto routes. Ford will eventually sell 15 million Model Ts before more sophisticated cars come along to replace it. Cars are so popular that in 1916, Congress passes new highway fund legislation, and the nation begins an era of unprecedented road building, bringing America closer together than it had ever been before. As celebrated as he is for his innovations, Ford did have a dark side. He could be a tyrant in his own factory, never allowing his workers to drive a competitor's car, and strictly enforcing a no-union policy until 1941. Regardless of these obvious shortcomings, Ford remains a beloved figure in history for his spirit of enterprise and for bringing the car into our lives. With the freedom given to them by their newly invented automobiles, some people explored the land, but others turned a restless eye to the new frontier, the sky. Since time began, people have dreamed of unlocking the secrets of flight. Many try, but it's not until the 20th century that someone finally succeeds. Two brothers working out of a bicycle shop in Dayton, Ohio, are dreaming up a machine that will carry a man into the sky like a bird. People think it's ridiculous, but the Wright brothers have faith in their wood and canvas contraption. In 1903, on a stretch of beach in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, Orville Wright shakes hands with his brother and straps himself into their flyer to make a daring attempt that will take human history into the skies. The flyer is mounted on a track facing the ocean and the onshore wind. Orville revs up the motor, and his brother Wilbur releases the restraining cable. Only 5 spectators witness the moment, including a Coast Guard patrolman who watches in disbelief as the craft went off with a rush and left the rail as pretty as you please, as pretty as any bird you ever laid your eyes on. The Wrights' achievement opens the door to a new era of daring aviation that constantly pushes the envelope of human flight. During the Great War, Zeppelins and airplanes come into play as tools of warfare. Each one's mission is to prowl the skies, strafing and dropping bombs on enemy lines. And when they meet in the air, it's usually the vulnerable Zeppelins that go down in fiery crashes. But the airplanes have their own enemies to worry about on the ground. Anti-aircraft batteries send up great bursts of flak, downing unlucky pilots. And when the airplanes meet in the skies over Europe, they engage each other in intense dogfights. These fights, high above the battlefields, produced the first flying aces among the British Royal Air Force pilots and their German counterparts, like the infamous Baron von Richthofen. In peacetime, daring aviators risked life and limb to ensure that the new airmail got through. In 1927, Charles Lindbergh gears up for an attempt at crossing the Atlantic Ocean from New York to Paris. He stuns the world when his famous airplane, the Spirit of St. Louis, is spotted over the French capital. Lindbergh becomes an instant hero. Amelia Earhart follows, bringing women into the aviation record books. She's met with adoration from around the globe upon her return to New York City. Years later, she and her navigator would disappear without a trace during an ill-fated attempt to fly around the globe. Radio operators reported hearing her faint calls, but her fate remains a mystery. Fresh from his Rough Rider fame in the Spanish-American War in Cuba, Teddy Roosevelt rides into the State House of New York, startling his fellow Republicans with his ideas of reform and regulation of the very businesses that support the Republican Party. Consequently, his constituents conspire to place Roosevelt in an office where his ideas could do no damage to the party, the vice presidency. Memorably, Senator Mark Hanna remarks, "Don't any of you realize there's only one life between this madman and the presidency?" In September 1901, an assassin's bullet kills President William McKinley, making Senator Mark Hanna's fear a reality. At 42, Theodore Roosevelt becomes the youngest president in American history. He brings a new age of progressive politics. One of the defining events of Roosevelt's presidency, and indeed of the budding age of industry, is the construction of the Panama Canal. In 1903, he declares that the policy of the country is a canal under American control. He fosters an American-backed revolution to create an independent Panama. One of Roosevelt's key negotiating points, the American warship Nashville, anchors off the Colombian coast. And so, Latin America is introduced to a tumultuous relationship with its overbearing neighbor, and the meaning of Teddy Roosevelt's famous proverb, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." With the canal zone secured, the colossal task of digging a path large enough to accommodate the bulk of freighters and battleships begins. Excavation is not the only problem the engineers face. Construction crews contract malaria and yellow fever, which breeds in the tropical jungles. With techniques learned in the Spanish-American War, crews spray the bush surrounding the canal to combat these deadly diseases. In 1914, after 3 presidents, 2 project engineers, and 11 years of work, the canal is finally finished. Suffrage, franchise. These were the words that defined the social struggle of many groups throughout the world. The right to a voice, the right to vote. The early part of the century provides a canvas for the struggle of the black population in the United States. Men like Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois lead the charge for racial equality, but change is slow to come. The struggle for black Americans is played out in the boxing arena. The star is Jack Johnson, the new world heavyweight champion, and the first black man to hold the crown. The challenger, Jim Jeffries, is the Great White Hope. July 4th, 1910, Independence Day, sets the stage for a bout between the races. With the sound of the bell, Johnson and Jeffries begin the match. The nation is riveted. Johnson's confident and flamboyant style offends the mostly white spectators. Each blow he delivers to Jeffries seems to symbolize the fight for civil rights, the fight for freedom, equality, and respect so desperately sought by America's black population. Many believe that Johnson purposely toys with Jeffries in order to prolong the battle. The fight drags on for a full 15 rounds. In the end, Johnson is victorious, delivering redemption to black America. But Jeffries' defeat at the hands of a black man is too hard for many whites to accept. Riots break out. In their wake, 11 die, and hundreds are wounded. A black intellectual at the time states, "It's a good deal better for Johnson to win and for a few Negroes to have been killed in body than for Johnson to have lost and all Negroes to have been killed in spirit." Other groups challenge their position in the status quo. In England, women raised their voices, demanding that full rights of citizenship be extended to include them as well. These suffragettes use radical tactics to draw attention to their cause. They will commit arson, storm government offices, and chain themselves to buildings. Many who serve time for their offenses call themselves political prisoners, while others try to rally public support for their cause. Women in America take inspiration from their English counterparts and form suffrage groups of their own. The same radical tactics work in America too, and while it often costs the suffragists jail time and hard labor, these movements are successful at bringing women's suffrage to the forefront of politics. Several states actually pass laws allowing women to vote, but the ultimate goal is to have a law at the federal level that amends the term "we the people" to include both sexes. Women organize around-the-clock picket lines outside the White House, making the point to President Wilson that a growing group of voters hold him accountable for the lack of political action. Ironically, in 1919, it's Wilson's wife, Edith, who literally takes the reins of the country, making presidential decisions when Wilson is rendered an invalid by a stroke. Finally, in 1918, a woman is elected to Congress, and her first move is to put a constitutional amendment before the Congress. By August of 1920, Wilson sees that the tide is turning and backs the measure that becomes the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. It states simply that the right of the citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Women have the vote. It was called the war to end all wars, and for good reason. Over 8.5 million people died, more than 21 million were wounded, and 7.5 million taken prisoner or missing. And perhaps the most astonishing number of all, 63 million men were mobilized to fight the war, more than half the population of America at that time. The assassination of Archduke Francis Ferdinand of the Austro-Hungarian Empire is frequently cited as being the cause of the Great War. But in reality, it's only the spark that ignites a great tinderbox that's been building in Europe for some time. Germany, France, England, Austro-Hungary, and Russia all build up their armies in anticipation of protecting, reclaiming, and even expanding their empires. The conquest of new lands and resources will ensure these nations' power in the new century. When the Austro-Hungarian Empire declares war on its neighbor, Serbia, a complex series of mutual protection treaties and royal bloodlines plunge an eager Europe in a bloody war. As the dominant Slavic power in Europe, Russia comes to Serbia's defense. It prompts declarations of war from Germany on Russia and France. England is bound to protect France and Tsar Nicholas as a descendant of Queen Victoria. Ironically, so is Kaiser Wilhelm. And so, battle lines are drawn, pitting the central powers of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Germany against the allied powers of France, England, and Russia. A stalemate of trench warfare begins in France at the Battle of Marne. Each side suffers an unbelievable 500,000 casualties. It's a 19th century style of battle using modern 20th century weapons. Lines of soldiers charge the enemy trenches in waves of thousands, only to meet a vicious hail of bullets from machine guns. And those who escape the guns are engulfed by clouds of poisonous gas. The loss of life is staggering, and ground gained by either side never seems to amount to more than a few miles. The carnage plays out again and again in stalemated battles at Verdun, Argonne, Somme, and Gallipoli. From America, President Wilson tries to mediate peace between the powers, but neither side shows any signs of letting up. They're not concerned with the stalemate on the muddy fields of Europe because the real lands in question are the colonial empires in Africa, Asia, and the Near East. And both sides are willing to sacrifice limitless men and munitions to get them. America has no desire to involve itself in this European conflict. The nation's interests are secure. Most of its population is made up of European immigrants from one side of the conflict or another. They have no desire to see their former homelands attacked by the United States. In 1915, the Lusitania, an English ship, is torpedoed by a German U-boat, killing nearly 1,200 of its civilian passengers. Although the Germans publish ads in American newspapers warning U.S. citizens not to travel on British liners, 128 American passengers perish in the attack. The sinking of the Lusitania does bring forth some calls for action. But contrary to what most textbooks say, it does not plunge the United States into the war. To the contrary, public sentiment is such that in 1916, President Woodrow Wilson runs for re-election and wins under the slogan, "He kept us out of war." Some eager Americans join up with the French Foreign Legion, the British Army, or in the case of Ernest Hemingway, the Italian Army as an ambulance driver. When British intelligence agents intercept the infamous German Zimmermann telegram promising Mexico possession of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona if they'll help fight against the United States, America wades into the fray of battle. On April 2, 1917, President Wilson stands before Congress asking for war. "The right is more precious than peace," he says, "and we shall fight for the things which we have carried nearest our hearts, for democracy." Congress applauds his speech, and Wilson remarks, "My message today was a message of death for our young men. How strange it seems to applaud that." President Wilson himself picks the first soldier from the National Lottery to be drafted to fight in Europe. Hollywood's new stars Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks, and Charlie Chaplin do their part to create enthusiasm for the war effort with war bond rallies. Entertainers keep the troops in good spirits. In March, before the American forces can arrive in full strength, the Germans stage a large offensive that pushes the Allied troops back some 40 miles. But they are repulsed and beaten back by an Allied counteroffensive at Soissons. The pendulum begins to swing in favor of the Allies. By September, Allied troops, including nearly 900,000 American soldiers, mass for the last major battle of the war. The British punch through the Germans' defensive Hindenburg line, and the Allies are on their way to the Kaiser's front door. The German military revolts, and chaos reigns over the country. The Kaiser is forced to abdicate. Germany indicates that it is ready to discuss the terms for peace, based on President Wilson's 14 points. On November 11th, at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, Germany signs an armistice ending the war. The Treaty of Versailles conscripts Germany to pay heavy reparations totaling $32 billion and requires the country to admit guilt for causing the war. Meanwhile, the Allies divvy up her colonial possessions. All of this leaves a bitter, defeated, and economically crippled Germany with a burden that will prove too much to forgive. Over a decade later, Adolf Hitler, a former corporal of the defeated German army, would rise to power on a nationalist fervor that seems the answer to Germany's despair. The Russian Revolution was a pivotal moment, not only for the first part of the century, but for the century itself. Building on the philosophy of Karl Marx, a small group of revolutionaries called the Bolsheviks staged a major coup that steered communism on a collision course with the democracies of the world.
The most important political event of the beginning of the 20th century was probably the Russian Revolution. Before World War I, no one foresaw the collapse of Tsardom, and Lenin certainly didn't foresee the collapse of Tsardom before World War I. There are quotes from Lenin in 1913 saying, "Gee, this doesn't look at all good," and he was in Switzerland a lot of the time, and I just don't think anything's going to come of all this. Now, the Allies, as you know, helped engineer the collapse of the Tsar in March or February of 1917.
With ever-expanding cities and industrialization, many societies have become close-knit indeed. Like many people, the Russians notice that there's an ever-widening gap between the powerful elite and the working classes who suffer in grinding poverty. The people grow tired of oppression under Tsar Nicholas and struggle to develop a doctrine that can unite the classes in equality. On and off since 1900, protesters filled the streets demanding power for the masses, igniting dreams of revolution in the minds of men like Vladimir Lenin. Trying to crush the revolution, the military fires into crowds of unarmed protesters. But this only unites the nation in smoldering discontent.
World War I was certainly the catalyst for the Russian Revolution. Russia was exhausted and fighting a war that it was doing badly in, and that was certainly the most important contributing factor to the 1917 October Russian Revolution.
Already taxed by the war, the Tsar cannot afford revolutionary chaos at home. He's forced to form the Duma, a legislative body that will address the concerns of the citizens. But the Duma is not enough. The nation has grown weary of the Great War in Europe. There are revolts within the Army and the Navy. Soldiers turn weapons against their own ranks. Some even march with the protesters in support of the revolution. These sailors from the battleship Potemkin are put in jail for bombarding government buildings with their naval guns. With the assistance of sympathetic troops, revolutionaries seize government buildings and critical points of industry. A provisional government is formed. Its leader, Alexander Kerensky, intends to keep up the war effort while making Russia a democratic state. But those ideas are short-lived. Aided by the enemy government of Germany, the exiled Vladimir Lenin is already steaming back to Petrograd on a train. Leon Trotsky, Leo Tolstoy, and Joseph Stalin also converge on the city from their places of exile. In his underground newspaper, Iskra, The Spark, and in powerful speeches, Lenin links the concept of democracy with the horrors of an imperialist war. He promises to put an end to the fighting and to put the power of Russia's great capitalist machine in the hands of the workers who make it run. This strikes a deep chord with the masses, and they rally behind the red flag of the Bolsheviks. Revolutions are the locomotives of history, Lenin says. Drive them full speed ahead and keep them on the rails. Stoked with the full heat of Lenin's revolutionary fire, the Bolshevik Reds take up arms and forcibly wrestle the reins of power away from the provisional government. Lenin's comrade, Leon Trotsky, cheers on and salutes the Red Army. There is no holding back the tide of communism. The Tsar's palace is taken over by the Bolsheviks, and the royal Romanov family is secretly executed. Having swept away the provisional government and the last traces of the old autocracy, Lenin installs himself as dictator and sets Russia on a new and ultimately doomed course of socialism. In 1924, after suffering 3 strokes, Vladimir Lenin dies. His body is put on display inside a mausoleum in Red Square, where mourners gather to pay their last respects, including his successor, Joseph Stalin, whose name comes to represent the very tyranny and oppression the Russian people fought so hard against. It was Winston Churchill who said of Lenin that the Russian people's worst misfortune was his birth, their next worst, his death. The seeds of the Russian Revolution also take root in America. The ranks of the Socialist Party are swollen with frustrated workers who feel abused by unregulated capitalism. But the looming threat of involvement in the Great War creates an anti-red sentiment that wipes socialism from the political scene. These are the early chapters of a story that defines the century: the opposition of democratic and socialist doctrines. After the horrors of World War I, people seemed to want to forget. Some indulged in the decadence of the 20s, but others were alarmed by this moral decay and fought to return to the good old days. The result? Prohibition. Whether in good times or bad, people always manage to have fun. The weekend has become a time to unwind, and crowds flock to the comedy and adventure of the silver screen. D.W. Griffith shows one version of history in his film, Birth of a Nation. Other Griffith films make Mary Pickford the world's first movie star. And Charlie Chaplin's lovable little tramp endears him to the world. Even out of costume, these two can't resist performing for the camera. Leading men and women of the movies become popular icons. Tabloid papers gain popularity. And to add even more sensation to the stories, articles often feature the public's favorite stars. Meanwhile, on Broadway, Florence Ziegfeld's Follies are a hit. And musicians like Irving Berlin, George Gershwin, and Louis Armstrong contribute to the popular sound of the day. In the 20s, people dance at marathon pace for good causes. The Charleston is popular, and in Europe and America, the South American tango is a craze. Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig thrill fans as they knock 'em out of the park. Fanciful balloons dance their way down Broadway in the first Macy's parade in New York. Women have fun with daring new swimwear and exotic hairstyles. There's a sense of political apathy and a disregard for conventions that alarms conservatives. In America in 1921, Warren Harding runs for election with a campaign slogan that sums up the conservative desire, return to normalcy. But as hard as conservatives try, there's no retreat to yesteryear. The cultural shift is already happening. More than any other issue, prohibition lays like an equator between America's divided halves. On the day prohibition takes effect, conservatives like Senator William Jennings Bryan applaud the great light that will shine down on the country's dark saloons. But as police close down breweries and bars, an illegal network of bootleggers and speakeasies springs up to fill the void. Even when they become known, the underground bars are seldom shut down. The police conduct raids, breaking up bottles and kegs of beer. But for all of the show, they cannot stop the production of alcohol, and some of the policemen are actually good customers. Ironically, the very measure that tries to stem society's ills only breeds new forms of corruption. Gangsters come of age. Al Capone finances an empire on the sales of illicit liquor. Men like Bugs Moran and John Dillinger famously flout the law. Although Dillinger meets with a violent end after a gun battle with federal agents. Prohibition's attempt to legislate morality is a failure. To the relief of many Americans, it's finally abolished in 1933. Churchill, Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini, Hirohito, and FDR. These were the men who influenced the second part of the 20th century. Their visions, whether constructive or destructive, shaped their time and the times we now live in. Thank you for joining us for our look at the great moments of the 20th century. I'm Laura McKenzie.